Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on this beautiful autumnal evening, I'd like to bid you a very warm welcome to the Ismaili Centre London, from where we are broadcasting this event on Ismaili TV. My name is Salima Bhatia, and I oversee the Department of Communications and Development at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's book launch event, which is being held in partnership with the Shia Imami Ismaili Council for the United Kingdom. This evening's event is an onstage discussion between Dr. Stephen Burge, author of a new book entitled The Prophet Muhammad, Islam and the Divine Message, and Dr. Shainool Jiwa, who is the general editor of the World of Islam series. The Prophet Muhammad, Islam and the Divine Message is the third book in the World of Islam series published by the IIS with Bloomsbury IB Tauris. Before I introduce you to our two speakers, first a little history about this building. The Ismaili Centre London is one of a number of Ismaili centres around the world that reflect the rich architectural heritage of Islam in contemporary buildings. This particular Ismaili Centre was opened in 1985 by His Highness the Aga Khan and the then Prime Minister, the late Baroness Thatcher. Ismaili centres are places of congregational prayer for Ismaili Muslims, as well as places for dialogue and learning. The Ismaili Centre London regularly hosts a wide variety of events and cultural programmes that bring together people from different communities with a view to promoting thought, knowledge, and awareness about a range of subjects relevant to a thriving civil society. The Institute of Ismaili Studies, or the IIS as it's fondly referred to, was also founded by His Highness the Aga Khan almost 43 years ago in 1977. Established in London, the IIS's mission is to preserve and study the intellectual and literary heritages of Shia Islam, with an emphasis on its Ismaili traditions. This is done by delivering a program of academic research, publications, and higher education, as well as by developing human resources and educational materials for the benefit of the global Ismaili community. Tonight's book launch event will be a conversation between Dr. Stephen Burge and Dr. Shainool Jiwa, who will explore a variety of themes drawn from Stephen's latest book in the World of Islam series on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The World of Islam series was developed to provide non-specialist readers with a reliable and balanced overview of the diverse manifestations of Islam. The books in this series seek to redress misperceptions by offering a more nuanced survey of the plurality of interpretations amongst Muslims around the world and throughout history. After all, Muslims, like the adherents of other faiths, express their faith and values through varied cultural, social, intellectual, and religious means. The World of Islam series is a civilizational series, and its books cover themes which are pertinent to Muslims and non-Muslims alike, encouraging readers to delve into commonalities as well as the distinctions that define different Muslim traditions. The other distinguishing feature of the books in this series is that they are short format and light in weight, substantive but lightweight. They are books that synthesize years of research and knowledge into a format that enables the non-academic reader to encounter some of the wonderful stories from Muslim cultures and bring lesser-known Muslim heroes and heroines to the fore. For those who prefer their written materials in other formats, the World of Islam books are also available online as ebooks and as audiobooks. The first book in the World of Islam series is entitled The Fatimids, The Rise of a Muslim Empire, Part 1, and it was written by Dr. Shainool Jiwa, one of the discussants at this evening's event. Shainool is no stranger to most of us, so I won't read out a list of her lengthy accomplishments. She is a senior research fellow and the head of the Constituency Studies Unit at the IIS, and she is a specialist in Fatimid history, a period on which she has conducted original research and published extensively. I'm told that in her spare time, Shainool is also a member of the Board of Governors for Edinburgh Napier University and has been involved with the International Baccalaureate Organisation since 1998, having been their chief examiner for Islamic history since 2001. Turning now to Dr. Stephen Burge, author of The Prophet Muhammad, Islam and the Divine Message, the book which is the focus of this evening's event. Stephen Burge is a senior research associate in the Quranic Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Stephen is also an ordained priest in the Church of England. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Edinburgh, where his research focused on the works of 15th century theologian and jurist Jalaluddin al-Suyuti. Dr. Burge has also written extensively on angels, hadiths or traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the interpretation of the Quran. The format of this evening's event will be an approximately 50-minute moderated discussion. Now to our discussants, Dr. Shainool Jiwa and Dr. Stephen Burge, for what promises to be an entertaining conversation.
Thank you, Salima, for the gracious introduction and for emceeing the event this evening, and for reminding us of the multifaceted roles that Ismaili centers play in our lives. They provide us with an enabling space to discuss the issues of the day, as well as to consider the learnings and teachings of enlightened figures such as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam, whose example, engagement, endearment, and reverence is the heartbeat of Muslim belief and practice. In many ways, this also reflects the ethos of the World of Islam series. It aims to entice and inspire Muslims as well as non-Muslims to develop a deeper engagement and understanding of Muslims, of their foundational figures, of their history, of their heritage, literature, architecture, and many other facets of lived Muslim life. And so, it is truly a privilege and very gratifying that we get to launch the third book in this World of Islam series in this space of the Ismaili Centre London. With those words, I welcome you, Stephen, to the Ismaili Centre London, and thank you for making the time to be with us, particularly in these challenging times that we are going through just now, and to have the opportunity to discuss the book that you have written in the series titled The Prophet Muhammad, Islam and the Divine Message.
Thank you very much for having me.
You perceptively start the book with talking about the very unusual, challenging times in which we live. And I thought perhaps it would be a good way to begin the discussion this evening for me to read from the introduction of that passage that you referred to, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Yeah? So I quote, "Understanding the world around us is at the heart of our quest as humans. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to others and the rest of the world inevitably impacts our behavior and beliefs. However, making sense of an often chaotic and capricious world can prove challenging, from rapid developments in technology and fluctuating geopolitical tensions to the looming climate crisis and increasing global inequality. The unpredictable nature of the world means that we can never fully be prepared for it or certain of the future. This can be fascinating and unsettling in equal measure. Most recently, we have been starkly reminded of this uncertainty with the coronavirus pandemic, during which this book reached its completion. While the devastating pandemic has brought to light the harsh reality of the precariousness of our world, it has also highlighted our increasing reliance on one another and our immense capacity for good. Realizing this potential through togetherness and acts of compassion can teach us how to not only survive but also thrive in an age of uncertainty, both individually and collectively. End of quote. So, Stephen, how has it been for you to live through these very challenging times and to write during this period?
Well, I think we've all found it very challenging. I think there was a period of shock when the coronavirus first reared its head, and also going into lockdown and not being able to see our friends and family, not be able to give hugs and just be with people. There's a deep sense of shock. But I think after a little while, we grew accustomed to the new world that we were in. And although it's a very strange land and strange world to be in, what has been really heartwarming in a way is the way that people have actually reached out together and have ventured into this world in a slightly different way to how they have done before, both in personal lives, in how people communicate with one another, but also in how communities have sought to look after each other in both secular and in religious contexts, but also just learning how to work within a new set of rules and in a new world, really. And I think it takes everybody a bit of time to adjust. Obviously, writing without access to libraries is quite a challenge.
It is.
But you work your way around it, and there are ways to do that. And
excellent.
with modern technology, it's amazing how easy it is
Yes.
to have editorial discussions and things like that.
Yes. Excellent. Also, I mean, you yourself being, of course, a man of faith, being a priest, communities have found it quite difficult to come together because, of course, our spaces of congregation have been our hubs of getting together, etc. Not having those access to those spaces as easily has also been challenging, and you will, of course, know of this firsthand.
Oh, definitely. I think especially that moved. I think we suddenly realised how important meeting as a congregation can be, regardless of which faith community people are from, for Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, whatever it may be, have all found that to be a struggle, to suddenly have to worship and engage in worship in more privately. And that doesn't mean that never happened before, but suddenly that contact with other people has been lost. I think that was a real shock for people. And I think particularly when those high festivals, those important religious festivals, I know for Christians, Easter occurred soon after lockdown happened, and the same with Ramadan and with the Hajj festivals as well. There's a real sense of loss at that point. And I know people have described it in terms of grief, that these things have been lost, but at the same time, religious communities have been able to adapt and to change the way that they engage. But I think also a lot of people have taken inspiration from their religious heritage, their religious tradition, from their religious leaders in order to adapt to that new way of being. And figures like Jesus and figures like Muhammad are real inspiration for Muslims in their everyday life, and the struggles that people have gone through in the past are the types of struggle that people are experiencing now in a slightly different way, of course. In the world it's different, it's not the same, but inspiration can clearly be drawn from our religious guides.
Which brings us to a very interesting question, right? You are a practicing priest from the Anglican tradition. What sparked your interest in wanting to study about Prophet Muhammad and to delve deep into Quranic studies, into Hadith studies? It's a fascinating...
It's probably not surprising, but I get asked that question quite a lot.
Sure.
And I think what I tend to try and tell people is that this idea of categorizing things into this is Christian ideas, these are Muslim ideas, these are Jewish ideas, and so on.
Yes.
But actually, the way I like to see it is actually this is a text describing something about God, something much deeper than our human classifications of things. And you don't have to be a member of a faith community to read text from another faith community, to understand more about God, to understand more about the world, and even actually to understand more about your own faith. And there's been plenty in my own experience of studying Islam that I've incorporated into my own faith, and which I admire greatly and has influenced my own personal spirituality. But then on another note, there's increasing tension between a whole host of different groups. Some of them are religious tensions between different religious communities, but also on top of that, political communities and so on. I think what we're seeing at the moment in the contemporary world is a real polarization and a real distinction between different categories of people and different categories of belief. And how we get over that division is actually by exploring one another and engaging in conversation with others in order to learn more. And it's in that understanding the other that people can come together and understand the world better and understand each other better, which makes for a better, more peaceful world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I look forward to talking more of those ideas because the world clearly needs those desperately. I mean, we have far more polarizing and I think divisive discussions as opposed to, as you say, coming together, learning more about each other, and therefore recognizing the commonalities, but also respecting the differences, I think, rather
definitely.
than...
I think respecting differences is a really important part.
Yes.
And exploring another faith makes you think more about your own faith and where you're coming from. It helps you to understand somebody else's background, but also just that exploration of issues of faith or even issues of somebody else's political views, just trying to get to grips with what somebody is saying actually helps you grow as an individual.
Yes.
And instead of dismissing other people, it's about engaging with other people.
Yes.
And that can only ever really be a good thing if you're actually really engaged in that process and are willing to open yourself up to exploring other people and other ideas.
Yes, yes. And to that extent then, I mean, as part of the World of Islam series project as well, to help Muslims as well as non-Muslims, as well as people of other faith traditions and none, to learn more about each other's traditions, cultures, key figures, etc. So in terms of your own aspirations for what you've put together in this book on Prophet Muhammad, what are the kinds of things you are hoping readers of different faith traditions might draw from a figure such as Prophet Muhammad that you've obviously written at length about in this book?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult indeed to separate the faith and Muhammad out. And just as you can't have Christianity without Jesus and so on.
Of course,
and I think to understand the life of Muhammad actually illuminates a lot of things about the nature of Islam and how everyday Muslims engage and respond and take on aspects of Muhammad's teachings, but also Muhammad's way of life and way of being into their own lives. So if you can understand something of Muhammad, you can actually understand something about Muslim cultures, Muslim identity, Muslim theology, which will help people of other faith to engage with people who are different to them of faith. But also I think even a Jewish or a Christian reader or whatever faith somebody may be, there's still something there that they can learn about the nature of prophecy, which the book details quite a lot about, asking what is prophecy, who is a prophet, and what does it mean to be a prophet. But I think also for those of no faith, there is still a lot of substance there for people to try and understand the nature of what it means to be a prophet, why Muhammad is so important to Muslim communities throughout the world, and how Muslim communities relate to Muhammad.
And in terms of Prophet Muhammad's own experience during his lifetime, and the experiences he had perhaps with other people of other faith traditions, either who were hospitable to him or who were rejecting of his message. Might be quite nice to hear a little bit about some of that.
There's a nice, very poignant story. Early on in Muhammad's career, he was subjected to abuse and rejection by the people of Mecca, the city where he was. And whilst he was protected by family members, other members of the really early Muslim community in Mecca weren't, and they were suffering really quite horrific persecution. And so the early Muslims were encouraged to perform essentially another hijra, another emigration to Abyssinia, to Ethiopia, to seek protection from there. And there's a nice story of the Christian king, the Negus, actually sheltering the Muslim community. And I have a section from...
That would be lovely for us to hear.
So this is from an account of the life of the Prophet by Ibn Kathir,
Okay.
the Mamluk scholar. So,
And the Mamluk scholar
so
Ibn
this is the
Kathir would write...
14th.
Great, 14th century.
So the Muslims arrive in Ethiopia, but some of the Meccans who are opposed to Muhammad come and try and get the other people back in order to have them punished. And there's, in a sense, a sort of a court case between the Meccans who are persecuting the Muslims and the Muslims who had sought sanctuary
And
there.
this happens, just to remind me of the order, this happens before
This happens
the
before the
emigration
emigration
to
to Medina.
Okay, all right.
So the Negus is asking the early Muslim community some questions about their faith. So the Negus says, "What is Islam?" And the leader of the Muslims there replies, "We worship God, and we associate no other God with him. And who has brought you this faith? A man from among ourselves whose face and genealogy we know. God sent him to us as he sent messengers to those who came before us. He ordered us to behave with kindness, honesty, trustworthiness, and good faith. He forbade us to worship idols and ordered us to worship God alone, who has no associate. But our people behaved with enmity towards us and towards our truthful prophet. They disbelieved in him and wanted to kill him. They wanted us to worship idols, and so we fled to you, bringing our faith and our blood to you, away from our own people. And regarding our greeting, the messenger of God told us that the people of paradise greet one another with a wish for peace, and he ordered us to do the same. When we greeted you the same way, so we greeted you the same way as we greet one another. And regarding Jesus, son of Mary, he was the servant and messenger of God. His word that he cast to Mary and also his spirit. He was the son of the chaste virgin. The king then picked up a stick and said, "My God, Mary's son did not add to this the weight of this stick more." And that last sort of cryptic sentence at the end is just to say that there isn't much, that the Ethiopian king said there's not that much difference between Christians and the early Muslim community, particularly in the way that they view Jesus. And I think what's quite nice about this story is that we have the outsider Christian king showing more compassion and more essentially love and welcoming to the Muslim community than the actual Arab community in Mecca who've been persecuting the community. So there's this slightly strange tension or irony that it's the outsider who should traditionally be opposed to the Muslim community is the one who welcomes them, whereas the early Meccan community who were the community who Muhammad was sent to are the ones that reject Muhammad and were persecutors of the early community.
And it just reminds me, as you are relating this, actually, Stephen, that when you think about the very first experience that the Prophet has, right, in the Gar Hira, in the cave of Hira, of receiving the revelation, right? The whole validation of that idea of prophecy, Khadija goes to her cousin, right, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who is a Christian monk, right, who recognizes the trope of prophecy and assures her that this is something that that Muhammad has now been graced with prophecy. It's a fascinating example.
It is, and I think what it helps illustrate is that attention that, well, not necessarily attention, but two kind of threads that go through the book, that the Quranic and the early Muslim and later Muslim conceptions of prophecy are kind of rooted in two spheres. The first is in Arabia, in Mecca. So the Prophet is described as being of really noble birth, in really fulsome Arab conceptions of what honourable people were, what nobility was about, and lots of descriptions and the qualities that Muhammad had are rooted in Arab ideals of chivalry and of honour. So it's deeply rooted in the Arab world. But we also see this link to the Judeo-Christian past, of the prophets of the past, of a link between Muhammad and prophets like Noah, Adam, Moses, and Jesus. So there's these twin poles which are looking towards the sort of biblical tradition, but also the Arab tradition. And Islam is very definitely not. There's an overlap between those two ideas, and they flow into and out of each other, and they work to form a distinctively Muslim conception of what prophecy is and who Muhammad was.
And so there's also this whole idea then of the Abrahamic traditions, right? Yeah. And as you said, the shared notions around prophethood, prophecy, around certain ethical ideas and values, but also in this whole conception of a creator and then sending a message, and so the prophet and the scripture. There are some very fundamental commonalities in terms of principles as well as ethical values, and perhaps
I think one of the really key themes in the book is this idea of change, and that's what prophets are really about. Prophets are about getting people to change the way they live, the way they engage with God, and the way they are. And it's about that response to the prophet, and we see that in the prophets of the past, in prophets like Noah, in prophets like Abraham, and so on. But it's also about that change that Muhammad is bringing about in Arabia to the people of Mecca. He is highlighting issues within society, both religious in their worship of idols and the move towards the worship of the one God, Allah. But there's also ethical concerns about the treatment of those who were more vulnerable in society, particularly widows and orphans, and also the way that even things like markets and how they were functioning, and the way that people were extorting money out of people. So there's this ethical, religious message, and the whole point of the Quran and the whole point of Muhammad's ministry is to engender change and get people to change their ways and to enter into a better relationship, both with God, but also with each other, to build a better society on earth.
Yes.
And I think that's something that both Jews and Christians will understand as well. That's an idea that is held in common and is a really crucial part of what it means to be thinking about God.
That brings us on very nicely to this whole idea of prophecy as a message from God, which you very creatively communicate in the book through a wonderful image of Noah and the ark, and the Annunciation. That whole. Tell us a bit about the story of Noah in the Quran, and some of the kind of key ideas that you think are really of interest and purpose then, but also today.
So the Quran does this very, very clever thing where it will talk about stories of the past and recount stories of people like Noah, of Moses and Abraham and so on. And they are ostensibly about Noah, but within them you can see that the ideas are actually being conveyed to the Meccan community as well. So the idea is that when Noah speaks, and in the Quranic accounts, Noah condemns his own people's worship of a series of gods and deities, you can hear that those questions are actually being directed towards the people that Muhammad was ministering to. So those stories from the past are sort of both in the past but in the prophetic present of the moment when they were being revealed. But at the same time, quite interesting, they're also relevant now. So the Quran is an oral text that has as much power now as it did to the people of Mecca. The way the Quran works and that it asks direct questions of people, it's almost like it's asking direct questions to people now, and is calling for that change and that amendment of life, that change in the way that people are in order to enter into a better relationship with God.
Very interesting. So it's not just about the message, but it's also the approach to how the message is communicated. It's very in the now, in the here and now, as it were, and it's a calling, as you say. And you, in the book, one of the very interesting examples I found was how you talk about this idea of the message and messaging, and how do you know that a message is actually authentic, or how does it grab your attention? You know, how do you know?
You're talking about the email.
Yes, I
So,
thought there was it had never occurred to me.
When we
Yes.
receive either email or things through the post,
Yes.
we receive things in particular formats so that we understand whether it's something that we need to pay attention to or whether it's something that we can just chuck in the bin. And
Recycle, hopefully.
obviously. and just, you know, if it's addressed personally to us, if it's on headed notepaper and so on, we will respond to that differently to if it just says to the occupier.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's the same for prophecy as well, that there were certain expectations of what a prophet would be like, how they would behave, what sorts of things they would proclaim and how they would proclaim it. And Muhammad satisfies a lot of these criteria of what prophets look like and how they behaved and what they did. So there was an expectation of what prophets, for that message to get across, the person giving the message had to satisfy almost like criteria of you know, what it meant to be a prophet to somebody in the ancient world. So things like having an awareness or an interaction with the supernatural is actually a really important part of how religions articulate the religious experience and the prophetic experience. So in events like the Prophet's ascension to heaven, that's actually a really important marker for the faith's expression that Muhammad was a prophet and experienced the divine world. To a historian, that's a different question, but on a religious level, it's an important statement, an important symbol of what is actually happening and who Muhammad was as a religious leader.
It's also very interesting talking about the Quran and messaging, and but the audiences of the Quran as well, right? That it has multiple audiences, that it speaks to various different audiences. And
Yes, so the Quran is always moving from one to another, and you know, sometimes it's directed to members of the community itself. Sometimes it's engaging polemically with people who are criticizing Muhammad's mission. Sometimes it's engaging with other faith communities. But beyond that and a bit deeper, it's also communicating to people in a wider time frame than just Muhammad's ministry in the early 7th century. It goes beyond that. And I think particularly in the way that Muslims have engaged with the Quran and with the interpretive material, in a way it's a living text that goes beyond that small period in time, and it means something anew.
Which is fascinating, right? Which for believers then makes it a work of reference, but a work of reverence as well. And
also I think it's important to regard Muhammad's life like that as well.
Yes.
He's not just somebody who lived in the early 7th century, but is somebody who not still lives, but is still important in the daily lives of Muslims throughout the world in a very real, very present way.
Yes, yes.
Which is important to remember, that it's not just a historical thing. There's actually, with a prophet and with a religious leader, there's something that extends beyond life itself.
And that whole presence of the love of and devotion to the Prophet as part of the lived Muslim experience is something you speak about quite a lot in the book.
I think it's quite an important part because actually to try and understand who Muhammad is and what Muhammad means to Muslims, regardless of their generation, is really rooted in their interaction and their relationship to Muhammad on a personal level. That's how prophecy is communicated and how prophecy plays out even all these years after the Prophet died.
Absolutely. And so it will be interesting, just, in these times of COVID, etc., how do you see a figure like the Prophet Muhammad being drawn upon in terms of the community, in its ways of seeking succor, in its ways of seeking, ways of coping, and also going beyond simply the day-to-day kind of challenges, but really to have some kind of hope in the future, as it were?
I think it's really easy to almost lapse into the sense of Muhammad as the victorious leader who established Islam and the political nature of that. But actually, in a lot of the accounts of Muhammad's life, both in the Quran, the evidence that we have from the Quran, but also in the accounts of his early life in the Sirah literature, we actually notice how precarious his position was. And actually thinking about when we talked about the persecution under the Meccans, you know, his life was precarious. You know, it wasn't guaranteed. You know, this victory wasn't going to be guaranteed. Wasn't guaranteed. And it's also, I think, the most touching bits are the accounts of Muhammad's relationships with his children and with his grandchildren, Hassan and Hussein. There are some really touching, intimate moments, particularly in the Hadith literature. There are descriptions of Muhammad playing with Hassan and Hussein, which is a kind of image you don't tend to think of a prophet. But actually, I think in a way it actually shows you how important those that both touch, but also play is important in our daily lives. To see somebody as important as Muhammad engage in it. But also, a lot of Muhammad's children did die. And there are lots of some really touching, moving scenes of Muhammad dealing with the death of his children. I think that's an important part of Muhammad's life that can be easily forgotten. And I think particularly in sort of these times of COVID, I think it really highlights some really important themes about grief, and that this is something that even Muhammad experienced and understands. And I think that helps a lot of Muslims to engage and to relate to Muhammad as almost as Muhammad isn't an ordinary man, but he is at the same time.
Yes, he experiences the same sufferings and the same.
There's some very moving accounts of Muhammad's death and Muhammad's acceptance that he is human. There's this story where the angel of death comes, but he asks Muhammad, and says to Muhammad, if you don't want to die, you don't have to. And Muhammad said, no, that's an important thing. And I think particularly at the moment, I think that's quite a moving, poignant thing. But I think that idea of Muhammad playing with Hassan Hussein, I think that's some of my favourite descriptions actually about that real love and enjoyment of life and that connectedness. And it helps portray Muhammad as a normal human being in a way, as well as this prophet who ascended into heaven and had spiritually intense spiritual revelations.
Yes. And it's one of the things I think in our days today, with all the social distancing that we ourselves are engaged in, and this whole rupture in terms of family life that people are experiencing, etc. That there is this, we as human beings are social beings, we relate to each other in particular ways. As you say, touch is important, being together is important. And so these are some of the ways in which, of course, remembering that these examples from the Prophet's life also are very, very illustrative and important. There's a wonderful image in the book again, another one that of this car stencil, where celebrating the Mawlid of the Prophet.
Birthday,
I thought it was a wonderful example of how the birthday of the Mawlid of the Prophet is celebrated in so many different forms and ways, and celebratory events in different parts of the world.
It was really interesting looking for images of the Mawlid, because it shows you how varied it is throughout the Muslim world. There's some really sort of street scenes in Karachi with sort of colourful banners everywhere. But I quite like that. I really do like that stencil image, because there's something quite moving about somebody being willing to spray paint their car in order to make a really public statement about their own devotion to Muhammad, their own spiritual connection with Muhammad, and their willingness to and their desire to actually go out into the world. And I think that's quite a dominant theme within the book, actually, about individuals' personal relationships with Muhammad and what that means and how that translates into their lives, and how that plays out. I think that's quite a moving sort of image, a striking image.
So there are these communal commemorations of the Prophet. But there are, and of course there are poetic commemorations, you know, the qawwalis and the nats and all that. But there are also these individual expressions of devotion.
And I think there's that, I think faith communities in particular really get that and play on that idea of personal devotion, but communal practice and worship as well. And I think there's a really strong play between individuals deepening and their knowledge and experience of God on a personal level, but also doing that as part of the community and coming together, particularly in times of celebration for things like the Mawlid, to actually come together and celebrate and say, this is who we are, this is a really joyous occasion.
So Stephen, in your book you speak about Prophet Muhammad being a bringer of law, of a code of law, of ethics, just as some of the previous prophets such as Moses had brought in a code of law, of ethics, etc. And there's a particular passage in the book where you speak about this in a way that really makes it very purposive and meaningful. It'd be great if we could have you read that.
I think that there's an important dimension to law, that it's not just about rules and regulations, but it's actually about trying to foster a deeper relationship between an individual and God, but also an individual and other people. So I'll just read the passage towards the end of that chapter. The life and practice of Muhammad inspired those around him in Medina and the generations that followed. The Sharia was not seen simply as a checklist of things that needed to be done to gain access to heaven, but it was seen as enhancing and developing people's spiritual lives. The Shi'i Imam and great-grandson of the Prophet, Zayn al-Abidin, captured this sentiment in one of the prayers in the collection that is attributed to him, titled Al-Sahifa al-Sajdiyah, the Book of the Constant Prostrator.
And this is, of course, for the Shia, the Imam Zayn al-Abidin, right? Yes.
So he writes, O God, bless Muhammad and his household, and give us success in this day of ours, this night of ours, and in all our days, to employ the good, stay away from evil, give thanks for favours, follow the Sunnah's norms, avoid innovations, enjoin good behaviour, forbid the disapproved, defend Islam, diminish the falsehood and abase it, help the truth and exalt it, guide the misguided, assist the weak, and reach out to the troubled. This prayer exemplifies what living according to the Sharia is all about. It is not simply following rules and regulations, but instead it's about embodying what it is that God desires for the world. In doing so, the supplication looks towards a future of success in which humans are rewarded for fulfilling God's will. Zayn al-Abidin here articulates the way in which following God's path on earth in the human world remains intimately related to the divine world. To get to the heart of the divine message that Muhammad brought, it is important to reflect on what Arabia was like before and after the message was proclaimed. As we have seen, Muhammad's message engaged with the context in which it was revealed. After its proclamation, and especially after the formation of the Muslim community in Medina, the ethical and religious worldview of the Quran became a social and political reality. Muhammad's role as a prophet and a messenger was pivotal in the establishment of a community that radically altered their existing beliefs and social structures. Muhammad's prophetic career was rooted in both the ancient and the new. The characteristics and manifestations of his prophetic mission were closely aligned with the experiences of the prophets of the past. As the Quran asserts, Muhammad's experiences were not those of a poet or a soothsayer, but they were a sign that he had received a divine message from God, like those before him. What the communities in Mecca and Medina were witnessing was not necessarily a new phenomenon. Muhammad's calling was representative of God's communication with humanity throughout the history of the world. However, it was the scripture that Muhammad brought to the people that established something new, a living social and political community. The new Ummah administered its own laws based on the revelations Muhammad received, established new social customs and interactions, advocated a deeper sense of social justice, and even adopted new regulations in business and commerce. As a prophet, Muhammad ushered in a revolution that transformed how a community behaved and related to one another. Muhammad came to embody the new way of living that God instructed the Ummah and indeed all people to follow.
Beautiful. What a wonderful way to bring the evening to a closure. It's been really lovely talking to you.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you
me.
very much for being here with us again and for really helping us see the life and times and the legacy of Prophet Muhammad. For Muslims, of course, he is a prophet and he's somebody who is very dear and very close to our hearts and in our lived Muslim experience, but also to understand him through your eyes, as a man of faith from another tradition, part of the Abrahamic traditions, but, seeing those commonalities and seeing those various ways of connecting has been very powerful, certainly for me and I'm sure for the audience as well. How appropriate and apt for our time as well. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us this evening and for having this excellent discussion around your book, which we look forward to very much, and which is titled The Prophet Muhammad, Islam and the Divine Message. I would like to remind the viewers that the book will be available online from Bloomsbury Publishing and other reputable e-tailers from 12th November 2020, and it will be priced around £8-9, depending on which part of the world you are purchasing it from. And also that e-copies and audio copies of the work will also be available. Please feel free to purchase your copy that way if you prefer to read it or listen to it rather. It will also be available through the Tariqa boards and their literature counters and also in the Jamaat Khana libraries shortly. So we hope that you will make the most of this opportunity to enjoy this excellent work. Before we close this evening, I would like to thank all the people that have made the event possible. The Shia Imami Ismaili Council for the United Kingdom and the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board, the Ismaili Centre London Events Services Team, the Audio-Visual Unit for Filming and Editing, and all of the uniformed and non-uniformed volunteers here today. Lastly, I'm pleased to inform you that the next Ismaili Centre London event will be our annual Milad al-Nabi lecture, marking the auspicious occasion of the birthday of our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This year's annual Milad lecture, which is entitled The Quest for a Moral Economy in the Post-COVID Era, will be delivered by Professor Muhammad Iqbal Asaria, CBE, who will be joined by Mahmoud Ahmad, who is the chairman of the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and the talk will be premiered on Ismaili TV on 11th November 2020. We do hope you will tune in then and join us for this exciting and upcoming event. Thank you, and Ya Ali Madad.